Hello, my name's Craig Seibert, and the topic of this short web seminar is titled Civic Excellence, the Challenge to Pastors and Christian Leaders, Living Up to the Spiritual Legacy of Those who have Gone Before Us. John Winthrop, a Pilgrim pastor, Puritan pastor from the 1630s, said this to those that came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony: "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill." Matthew 5:14 says, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all the professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants, and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we be consumed out of the good land whither we were going." See, John Winthrop knew that this spiritual pilgrimage that the Puritans were on to establish a biblical commonwealth and a healthy, civically functioning society would be made or broken by how they lived their lives and how they established themselves as a city upon a hill. 10 years before John Winthrop's journey, there was a covenant made by an earlier band of spiritual pilgrims, and their pastor was John Robinson, and these were the pilgrims of the Plymouth colony of 1620. And this was said about them: "They cherished a great hope and inward zeal of laying a good foundation, or at least making some way towards it, for the propagation and advance of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world, even though they should be but stepping stones to others in the performance of so great a work. Yea, though they should lose their lives in this action, yet might they have the comfort of knowing that their endeavor was worthy." And so they were sailing for Virginia. Providentially, they were blown off course. They landed in the Massachusetts Bay area, and eventually came upon shore near Plymouth. And because they had no governing charter to establish a colony outside of the Virginia Commonwealth, they had to come up with their own compact for governing. And they created a covenant with the God of heaven and earth called the Mayflower Compact. And it reads as this: "Having undertaken this voyage for the glory of God, the advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of king and country, in the name of God and one another, we covenant and combine ourselves together as a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation, for the furtherance of the ends aforesaid means," which means for the furtherance of these ends above, the glorifying of God, the advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of king and country, with the power to enact laws and ordinances, offices for the general benefit of the colony. And this short Mayflower Compact turns out to be the compact that then the Connecticut Constitution was modeled after, and then several state constitutions after it, and then eventually the federal Constitution, all within the framework of establishing biblical covenants with the God of heaven as they created a civil society here on earth. These two pastor pilgrim leaders, John Winthrop and John Robinson, knew what was at stake in establishing biblically functioning communities in the New World. 150 years later, John Adams, second President of the United States, continued to describe the role of the pastor in society and civic thought. He said this: "It's the duty of the clergy to accommodate their discourses to the times, to preach against such sins that are most prevalent, and to recommend such virtues as are most wanted. For example, if exorbitant ambition and venality are predominant, ought they not to warn their hearers against those vices? If public spirit is much wanted, should they not inculcate this great virtue? If the rights and duties of Christian magistrates and subjects are being disputed, should they not explain them, show their nature, their ends, their limitations, and their restrictions, how much soever it may gall the people of Massachusetts?" And so what he's saying here is the order of the day that was needed in 1776 was the preaching and biblical exposition of the roles, responsibilities, and constraints of civil government. Before that, he previewed the fact that in a theological sense, a pastor should preach to whatever needs society is facing at the time, regardless of what the hearers want to hear. That's exactly what the patriot pastors of the American Revolution did. Referring to the patriot pastors in the Revolutionary period, particularly John Adams called out Reverend Dr. Mayhew and Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper and said this: "They were the most conspicuous, the most ardent and influential in the awakening and revival in the American principles and feelings." And in the context of this quote, he's basically saying is it was the clergy during the Revolutionary period that laid the philosophical seedbed that the thoughts and thinking of how to create a philosophy of government and a civil functioning government were needed, and how those things needed to be anchored in biblical truth. All of that teaching and the atmosphere creating around that thinking was created from the pulpits of the American Revolution. David Barton of Wall Builders has done some excellent research in this area, and now in this web seminar you'll benefit from some of that. David points out that several books were produced about the patriot pastors of that period. One called The Pulpit of the American Revolution, a second called The Patriot Preachers of the American Revolution, a third called The Chaplains and Clergy of the American Revolution. And what he goes on to say is that there was two types of sermons that these pastors would preach, and they were very worldview oriented. There was what was called occasional sermons, and that meant that there was an occasion that called for biblical thought. For an example, in 1755 there was a New England earthquake, and Reverend Mayhew, who John Adams referenced earlier, did a 5-part series on what the Bible says about earthquakes. There was a great fire in Boston, and that same pastor did a sermon on what principles does the Bible teach about such tragedy. He was preaching that even in 1760, years before the Revolution. There were sermons on a solar eclipse. There was sermons on an execution and how the civil government has been given that power to protect people based on Romans 13, and why in this case execution was warranted at the hands of the civil government. These preachers taught about the infirmities and comforts of old age, and David Barton even references a sermon that's post-revolutionary and then the Civil War period about the moral view of railroads, God's plan for transportation. So even after the Revolutionary period, these pastors had pulpits where they were articulating a biblical worldview. And so those are some of the occasional sermons. More interesting, relevant to our topic, is there's also annual sermons that were preached. Annually, there was an election sermon preached. What did God expect in the selection of leaders? What does he expect of civil government? This was preached from 1634 in Virginia for every year up until the 20th century. There were candidate sermons, comparing what the candidates have said with what the Bible says. There was the biblical principle of lawmaking sermons that were preached before state legislatures in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and other state legislatures. Sam Adams and John Hancock actually sat underneath this teaching, where preachers would espouse the principles that were lived out by biblical characters like Moses, Daniel, Joseph, and others that fulfilled responsibilities in civil government. There was even an artillery sermon identifying the proper role of the military. And so thank you for Wall Builders and David Barton for highlighting some of these, that we might learn from them and see exactly what these patriot pastors were preaching. As I mentioned in a previous web seminar, Dr. John Witherspoon also exemplifies these patriot pastors and their giants of intellectual thought. He was pastor and president at Princeton University, wrote the Constitution for New Jersey, was elected as a delegate to the Continental Congress, debated and signed the Declaration of Independence, and Congress was so impressed by his wisdom and breadth of understanding that he served on the most important committees that were needed by the Congress. And so these are just a sampling of the pastors during this period. Here are several more of them that are identified and are both written about in those books as well as written about in various elements of history. Thankfully, each of these works have been produced in a modern day reprint, And you can find these if you go to the internet and to your favorite bookstore or use the Google tool to find these very titles, and you can read them again. These patriot pastors of the American Revolution had a biblical worldview of all of life and taught and preached the Bible to be applied in all areas of life. What this means, as we've been discussing already, is they taught the responsibilities and roles of these structures in society, the individual, the family, the church, and government. They taught the 8 components of civic excellence. Although they didn't have this diagram before them, they touched base and regularly taught through all these areas. They taught a biblical worldview, in fact, of all of life. And on this biblical worldview wheel, that's a modern day version of teaching a worldview to all of life that you can benefit from at biblicalworldviewtraining.org. It's just a sampling of an idea of how they approached their teaching of biblical principles and how they truly did apply to all of life and created an integrated vision for all of life. So as we begin to wind down, let's finish off our challenges from these spiritual giants of the past. Reverend Charles Finney, a post-revolutionary pastor of the Second Great Awakening in the 1830s, said this about the role of pastors in society. If there's a decay of conscience, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the public press lacks moral discernment, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the church is degenerate and worldly, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the world loses its interest in Christianity, the pulpit is responsible for it. If Satan rules in our halls of legislation, the pulpit is responsible for it. If our politics become so corrupt that the very foundations of our government are ready to fall away, the pulpit is responsible for it. And so Charles Finney really lays out the challenge for us as he exemplifies and preaches out those truths. Finally, Martin Luther, a reformer and the genesis for this integrated worldview and having the scriptures be taught as relevant to all of life, said this: If I profess with the loudest voice in the clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God, except precisely that little point which the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, I am not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing Christ. Where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldier is proved. And to be steady in all the battlefields besides the one where the point is needed is mere flight of disgrace if he flinches at that point. So Martin Luther was saying, basically, if pastors and Christian leaders fail to address the most pressing, critical issue, moral issue of the day, and they avoid that, they may be professing Christ, but they're not confessing Christ. And so as we close, I'm going to revisit this quote from John Winthrop because it seems to describe where we find ourselves in the United States of America at this point in time. It says, if you recall at the beginning, before he said this, if we deal falsely with our God, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all the professors for God's sake. For we will shame the faces of many God's worthy servants, and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. This seems to be the stress point that we find ourselves in the United States as we've abandoned God and the church has abandoned the civic arena. So we've looked at a great cloud of witnesses, and the Bible speaks to us about this very area. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And so here is our patriotic cloud of witnesses, and this is just a handful of the many that sacrificed and surrendered so much for both the preaching of the biblical worldview, the freedom of conscience, the freedom of religion, and the freedom of living with the maximum liberty in a healthy, functioning society. In Dead Poets Society, standing before a trophy case, Robin Williams, the actor that was the teacher in that movie, said, "Carpe diem. Can you hear the voices of the past calling out, 'Seize the day'?" My question for us is will we seize the day as we understand again these truths. My name's Craig Seibert. Thanks for listening.